Hello, everybody. How are you? It's Stephen again. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I hope you've had a wonderful day. Like I said yesterday, I'm going to have my wife, Unami, join me, and we're going to discuss together Proverbs chapter number 7, which is day 7 of 31. And so, Unami, welcome.
Thank you.
And tell me, how have you found the dive into Proverbs? What have been some of your takeaways? And do you find, what's the importance of wisdom from your perspective?
Well, thanks for inviting me, first of all. It's really been good listening to, Stephen talk about wisdom from his perspective. So the importance of wisdom, I think, is that it guides everything that we do. We need it for every area of our lives, whether it's parenting or your marriage or relationships, business, every aspect. So I think you can't, move without wisdom.
Yeah, it's good. So today is, it's an interesting one. I'm using the New Living Translation, and it says, another warning about immoral women. So tell me, what are some of the verses? I mean, this chapter's got 27 verses. What are some of the verses that stand out from your perspective, and what insights can you bring from them?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things that stood out is that it talks about how this young man, it says he's a young man with no sense because he went near her house, and also he went in the direction of where she was, and also he did it at twilight, and so to me, it's really speaking about the fact that there are certain conditions that have to be in place in order for you to engage in any type of wrongdoing. And that's exactly what this young man did. He went near, right? So if we're going to do wrong, we probably have to be in that proximity. It also talks about he went in her direction. So he was choosing to go that way. He could have gone any other direction, but he went in that direction. And says also twilight. So that time of day when, generally there's certain things that happen at a certain time of the day, nighttime, all the things that you can think of that go wrong happen at nighttime. Yeah. So to me, those are the things that kind of stood out in terms of, how he was drawn into doing wrong. And I think that we can all be enticed to do those things.
Perhaps, looking at that young guy, another key thing is you have to know yourself. I think that's a key thing, is that know thyself. And once you know what, like we spoke about a few days ago, what some of those appetites are that can lead you down the wrong path, whatever they may be, is that once you know yourself, you're obviously not going to, you will then learn to not put yourself in a position where, or in an area where you become very vulnerable. And I guess the key thing there is that if you do know what the appetite is, disclose it, because it's when stuff is hidden that then it becomes dangerous, and then it tends to hook you in even more strongly. But once it's confessed, once it's known, then it's no longer going to be that vice that has a grip over you, because you're looking to deal with it in the open.
Yeah, I agree with that, the importance of knowing yourself. I think the problem is people have got blind spots. So even though you might think you know yourself, right, there's certain things that you may not know about yourself. And even if people highlight those things to you, if you're not self-aware, the chances are you're going to deny that, and you're going to keep moving along the same way. Yep. So I think it's more than just knowing yourself. It's, I think you're going to speak a bit about that, but, I think there is more to it than just knowing yourself.
Well, look, the reason I say that, perhaps if you've got blind spots, but the reason how you will know yourself is that if you keep tripping up over the same thing over and over and over again, then you know that, okay, there's a specific vulnerability that I have. Therefore, that's part of, knowing yourself, even if it talks about...
So it's know your weaknesses, essentially.
But that's part of knowing yourself.
Yeah.
But the other key thing is that it is, how close to the line should you walk because sometimes it's when we play with walking on the line, just thinking, I just want to see how far I can go. Sometimes we want to push the limits of where we can take things just to see whether we would have the strength to pull back.
Yeah.
And I guess the problem with that is that you have to understand is that being human, when you allow yourself to get to the edge, your humanness takes over, and then you find yourself on more occasions than not tipping over the other side, but rather than staying on what we would call perhaps the safe side.
And I think the problem is that people have a tendency to kind of lie to themselves, or even this whole thing about willpower. I think it's overrated, willpower, So somebody might know their weaknesses, but they think to themselves, I can handle this, this is not a big deal. So if somebody maybe has a tendency to have, addictive behaviors, so maybe drugs or something like that, and then they go and hang around with people who are taking drugs because they're thinking, they're my friends and, I'll be okay. I've been here before. They're lying to themselves, but also they kind of relying on willpower, which I feel is overrated.
Or look, you're really putting yourself in a dangerous position if you begin to rely on that.
Yeah.
So I think the opening statement says, follow advice, my son, always treasure my commands, obey my commands and live. Guard my instructions as you guard your own eyes. Tie them on your fingers as a reminder. Write them deep within your heart. And it's talking about keep them at the forefront of your mind. And then most importantly, it's saying that, you got to write those. There has to be an indelible impression upon one's character as you begin to absorb the words that your father had, well, in this instance, the father has spoken these commands that he's been asked to treasure. Once you internalize it, internalizing that will then change and develop your character. Internalizing those words of wisdom will then change and internalize your character. But a key thing, it's, of course, one of the things I had written here is that in this instance, the way this adulterous woman comes is very obvious by the way that she dresses.
Yes.
And then it's quite obvious that I can see that a mouth coming off. So it's not real. Sometimes it's the ones that you see that can be obvious, but sometimes it's the subtle things that we may not be aware of that can have a very significant impact or can impact us more significantly than something that comes very obvious. So if you've got ice cream is your issue, we'll just speak with ice cream because it's nice and simple. Then you know that if somebody's going to serve you, if you know that you're going to a festival where there's ice cream, it's either you don't go to the festival. But it's only when things are done, and maybe that's a poor example, but all I'm saying is that it's the subtle things. It's when things don't come in an obvious manner that they can actually sink their teeth into you.
Yeah. So
it's also to be mindful of those things that don't come in the obvious manner, because if they come dressed all good, you're like, oh, okay, that's a bit obvious. But what happens if it's more subtle than that?
Yes. Yeah, and it brings to mind this whole idea about that, that there is good and evil, and that there's an enemy and he comes to kill, to steal, and to destroy. And so, or even the scripture that talks about that, the enemy is always looking, like a roaring lion looking whom he may devour.
Yeah.
So sometimes if we're not aware of that, the fact that, there is an evil, that there is an enemy of God, an enemy of the purposes of God for our lives, then we can live our lives very carelessly. But I think it is important to be actually conscious of the fact that, there is actually an enemy out there who has different plans to what God has. And so they will entice you, they will, bring things to your hearing. I know the last message you're talking about, the things that we hear and the things that we see. Sometimes we look at those things as if they're just innocent, but there is actually a strategist behind that.
No doubt.
Yeah.
And I like it's not a question of I like. It says, there's a promise that comes, where the seductive woman comes and she promises that, everything is going to be okay. It's going to be great. But one of the key things that she does is not explain. There's this thing where she says, look, we can just do what we want, but there's no commitment. And I think sometimes that's what happens, is that it's because we know that when you are committed to somebody, when you're committed to something, it actually takes work. And it's not something that is just flippant and trivial and passing. It's going to be something that requires work. And so she made it quite obvious. And I think sometimes when we begin to look at just characters, this young person should have known by the fact her word said, for my husband is not at home, he's away on a long trip. And so he should have thought to myself, dang, maybe I shouldn't have said that, but anyway, that you would have thought that, wow, if she can do that to her husband, then, I need to sort of like be very mindful of what is going to happen to me as a result of that.
Yeah, I found verse 16 was also very interesting, and that's because I love the color purple. It says, I don't even know, it doesn't say purple there. I don't know why I said that. It said, I have covered my bed with colored linens from Egypt. I've perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. Come, let's drink deeply of love till morning. So it was just like she went out of her way, to make sure that she had prepared everything. And I think when sin comes into our lives, it is enticing, because there's all this, it's almost like there's an
enchantment.
Yes, there's something that's associated with it that is just really, it draws you, it's comfortable, it's exciting,
Yeah. And so anyway, verse 21 says, so she seduced him with her pretty speech and enticed him with her flattery. He followed her at once like an ox going to the slaughter. He was like a stag caught in a trap, awaiting the arrow that would pierce its heart. He was like a bird flying into a snare, little knowing it would cost him his life. And this is where we sometimes talk about not being aware of, or she not, I guess, being unaware of what those weaknesses are. Because I think if you don't know thyself, you are not going to be aware that you're actually going into a trap. And that's really the key thing, is I feel anyway, that knowing yourself, knowing what some of your weaknesses may be or what your issues are, then you can have somebody who's always checking in on you, not as a policeman, but as somebody there to support you and to lift you up. Because it's not really about, people in the church policing each other. But it's really about, because you care for one another. So we are there to support. And I think moving it away from just this, there's obviously the seductive woman, is also this whole thing of not taking shortcuts, and I think it's like a get rich quick scheme, when you sort of like something flashes on your phone and says, pay me 100 and you're going to get 200 or 300 tomorrow. Is that you understand, is that these things that are enticing and flattering, they're very temporary. They're very temporal. They don't last a very long time. So that's something. And I remember someone saying to me once, he said, Magwenzi, there is no such thing as quick money. And I think that even for a good, whether it's a relationship, it's going to be commitment and time and effort. And it's not just about, sometimes perhaps there isn't all the whole enchantment stuff that happens. But it's really about saying, I'm going to be committed to this process, or whether it's marriage, and I'm not going to try for these shortcuts or get rich quick schemes. Also, when people always celebrate the anniversary, they're like, oh, great, we've been married 40 years. But I bet you, of those 40 years, there have been times of absolute acrimony.
Yeah, exactly. Just when you're talking, the one thing I was thinking about is just the saying that all that glitters is not gold, And I think sometimes that's what happens, there's all these things that are shining, at us. And, with the young men that we've been talking about, it pulls you. And like you said, moving it away from the whole adultery thing, there are many things that are kind of constantly pulling at us.
Yeah.
And I think when you talk about commitment in marriage and all of that, it brings to light this idea of, what role do you as an individual play in how life turns out for you, just being intentional. Because I think that the big thing here is accountability. Can you speak a bit about that? Because I always find it a very interesting thing, that the role of accountability in, because you have wisdom and you read the word and listen to everything, but then there's accountability. It doesn't mean that just from reading the word, you're going to do it,
Well, the reality is that life happens to everybody, and when I say life happens, is that temptation comes to everybody, and sometimes it's not a matter of if, it's always going to be a question of when it comes, and it can come, like we say, in seasons. Just like you heard when Jesus was tempted by the devil, it said after he sort of like rebuffed the devil, it says that he went away waiting for another time. And these things, there's always a temptation that it comes in waves or in seasons. This is why it's important, like I said earlier, about knowing thyself, because when you know yourself, when you speak to somebody, what are they going to keep you accountable for if you don't think you got any issues? So I think it's about when you know yourself and you can confess to somebody and say, look, man, this is my kryptonite, or this is my Achilles heel, or this is an area where, I would really like some support. But remember that it's not something that accountability doesn't mean that the fact that I can speak to somebody and confess to them, I'm just going to continue in that vein. It's about something that I recognize that, there's just something, whether it's a character issue that I need to work on, so that, because really we don't want to be stuck in that zone that we're in. So again, find somebody that you trust, that is of good character, that is not a blabbermouth, not having a gossiping problem, and that you can then, confide in, have their confidence that if you tell them stuff, it's in the vault, that they're not going to go and say, oh, did you hear so-and-so said this? So I think, and that's the way accountability works, is that, if I'm accountable, then if somebody asks me and says, so how are you going? I have to be truthful and say, look, I'm struggling, I'm not going too well, or things are good.
Yeah, I think that's really good. I mean, I know that, you're somebody who's always kind of liked or been drawn to mentors and, all that kind of stuff. And I think it's quite valuable. But I think there's some people who don't necessarily see the value of it, or they don't think it's that important. But when I look back to the scripture that's talking about that, this woman's house is, it says something about that's where death lives. I can't remember what it said, but it said something about it being the grave. It's like going to the grave. And yeah.
Her house is the road to the grave. Her bedroom is the den of death.
Exactly. So I think that, this accountability, I mean, we could go on and on about it, but for me, it's just one of those things that I think people underestimate or undervalue. And, I think that's something that you've always kind of placed great value on, and I've appreciated that. So, yeah, it's been good. I feel like there's so much more in there, but of course, in the interest of time, we have to stop. We did have a bit of an interruption there. So if you heard any noise in the background, that's, kids in the house. So hopefully that's not too much of a distraction.
Yes. Anyway, so look, thank you so much for joining us. And then tomorrow, day number 8, I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day, and
peace. Okay. You didn't do peace today. Okay. Bye.